And we're live. Welcome to the Fall Channel and our second episode of the day. What if the Star Wars sequels were great? So, this is the first time I believe I've covered Star Wars on this channel, but it was the first time for everything. So, this episode of the Fall Channel is going to be divided into two parts. So, the first part is going to be me just kind of going over common criticisms, as well as my own personal criticisms of these Star Wars uh, sequels. The second half, we'll be diving into a little bit of more of a broad strokes of my thoughts about the entire scope of where exactly the Star Wars sequels could have gone great, as well as a little bit more of a, I hate to say it's more of fan fictiony sort of exploration into what I think, things should have happened with it. But, these things happen. And I hope you'll indulge me. I might actually turn the second half of this video into an actual series of videos exploring what I think might have been a little bit better off for the Star Wars prequels or sequels had they, given me the reins. Not that that was ever going to be a realistic expectation, but I did write pretty extensively about how I would have done it. And I think that it's worth kind of making a video series about it eventually. Maybe if there's a little bit more of a pull for it, we'll get something done with that, but we'll see. But anyway, we're here to talk about Star Wars. So, for those of you who are watching in the replay and want to get involved, definitely let me know what's your favorite Star Wars trilogy, or what do you think of the next set of things that they're trying to do with Star Wars. Personally, I'm a big fan of the original films. Episode 4, A New Hope; Episode 5, Empire Strikes Back; and Episode 6, The Return of the Jedi. Now, of those three films, I think the best film, and it's not surprising, most people believe the same, The Empire Strikes Back is the best of the original films, at least in terms of where they go with it. Now, some people, like my dad, would go so far as to say that A New Hope is probably the best, and that's where the Star Wars franchise has peaked, and it's not gone back to that. So I don't know. I guess that's fair. I don't know if I share the same opinion, but that is where we're at on that. So what I think would be the best of the Star Wars prequels. Now these are the ones I actually got a chance to grow up with. Now I've recently had a better opinion of them, considering the fact that I don't have as good of an opinion for the sequels. So maybe that's just now we have something to compare them to. So that's the difference. Although I have found it hilarious how the Star Wars prequels have gotten a lot more of a critical, re-evaluation in the last few years, and I think it's mostly from people like me who grew up watching them, so that can't be too surprising. But at one point, I used to think Episode One, The Phantom Menace, was probably the worst of the entire thing, but now that opinion has shifted to being Episode Two, The Attack of the Clones, being the worst of the prequel films. So I mean, going back to the original films, so it's not that I find the Return of the Jedi to be bad. It's not bad. The Ewoks are still kind of a meh thing that are there. I would have preferred it to have been instead of Endor, it could have been Kashyyyk, and then instead of the Ewoks, could have been just Wookiees, and then you could have included a little bit more um, material with Chewbacca, and that would have made him more of an active role. It would have given more of an active role in the film. So I don't know. But I'm also one of those people who thinks that Alderaan, or rather Naboo, should have been Alderaan because that's the first thing we're introduced to. I mean, there's like three or four different like planets that have like a royal family set up, but it's also set up to where they have like democratic values as well, which I find to be weird. Because you have Naboo, then you have Alderaan, Chandrilla, and Corellia, I believe, even some stuff in Coruscant. These are all planets that are technically not related, but they all have humans on them, and they're all societies with like aristocracy that control their local systems, which I find also very interesting. And I just think it would have been more impactful had they blown up, had they showed all Duran in the prequels. That way, when they blow it up in A New Hope, there would have been more of that kind of um, connective tissue that would have been more impactful, at least from an emotional lens, I think. But again, we have what we have. So with that, um, the kind of bigger, larger issue that I would kind of want to explore with that is that even though I do think Attack of the Clones is the worst of them, I think that the best of the prequels really is Revenge of the Sith, strictly because it is just kind of a good movie in the sense that it actually completes a story that was set up in Episode One and then expanded on in Episode Two and then completed in Episode Three. So in that sense, I think the prequels are unparalleled in terms of like where that plot line goes. It goes somewhere, and it was never lost on any of us. That's where it was going to go, and I think that's part of the reason why I think I would rewatch Episode Three as probably the only movie of the prequels that I would rewatch with any frequency. But then we get to the sequel films. So the sequel films include Episode Seven, The Force Awakens, Episode Eight, The Last Jedi, and Episode Nine, The Rise of Skywalker. So I actually kind of liked The Force Awakens. I went to the El Capitan Theater out here in LA, and my dad and my brother's ex girlfriend's mom. That's a lot. We were there. We were watching it, and I actually thought it was kind of good. I think we missed like 30 minutes of the movie though, because of traffic. But no, it was actually pretty good for the most part. I mean, it was a rehash of A New Hope in many respects, although it did make certain bold narrative choices that I thought were interesting had they been followed through a little bit more in the next two films. But what can you do? That namely being the fact that um, Kylo kills Han, and that's a very like humongous narrative decision because I mean ultimately at that point you've now made it to where Kylo can only be redeemed through death, and that's kind of insane. But with that, they also blew up the entirety of the New Republic, which I guess no longer has its headquarters on Coruscant. Instead, they have like a rotating capital. This is at that point it's on Hosnian Prime, which also gets blown up, and every other planet in its system also get blown up in that single moment, which I think is a bit much. But there's a lot of problems with the sequels. So what I will say is that I actually have grown to kind of like The Last Jedi in terms of it just trying to do something different. I didn't like it at first. I actually thought it was pretty bad. But now I've gotten to think about it. I'm thinking that it's not that bad. It's not that good, but it's not that bad. Then you have the Rise of Skywalker, which I will not defend. I think it's a really bad movie. And part of the reason it's such a bad movie is because it's doing damage control on The Last Jedi. And that's the problem. So without further ado, well, before I get to that, the worst film in that series is The Rise of Skywalker. The best film is The Force Awakens, but I don't think I watch The Force Awakens as often as I probably should, I guess. I mean, I watch the best films of the other two trilogies way more often than that. So I want to dive into the sequels, but before I do, there's actually been a development in the Star Wars series. In the entire Star Wars franchise, there has never been this thing. Now, I have not seen The Acolyte. I have not seen Ahsoka. I have not seen any of that other stuff. I have seen The Mandalorian. I've seen other things as well. But when Andor was released, me and my wife watched the Star Wars films in order. So we watched episode one, two, three, Rogue One. I told her we're not going to watch Solo, so that's probably tied for the worst film of the franchise, I think, with The Rise of Skywalker. I might have to reevaluate that if I ever watch Solo again. I don't plan to. Then we watched 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. And so at that point, we were done with it. So we were doing that in preparation for May the 4th. May the 4th be with you early this month. So we were doing that. We watched it all, and I came to a conclusion that I had never watched Andor, and I also discovered that Andor was going to come out and premiere its last few episodes or whatever. And I decided to do my own rewatch or watch of that series. And I watched all of season one, and then I binged through all of season two. And I shit you not, I must have been part of like the first group of people to watch it because I literally watched, I think, the whole first half or the first 3 quarters of the Andor season two, and then right at 6 o'clock, I had like 15 minutes, I think, in between the end of episode 9. So that episode 10 started, then episode 10, 11, and 12. I watched it in rapid succession. So that day that it came out, that's what I was there watching. I was watching that thing all the way through. And by the time it was over, I became 100% convinced. Now, I wasn't part of the group of people that decided to watch Rogue One afterwards. I still think I should. But we now have a new Star Wars trilogy on our hands. If you regard Star Wars Andor Season 1 as the first episode, Star Wars Andor Season 2 as the second episode, and then Rogue One as the final installment in that, we'll call it the Rebellion saga. And it's pretty good. Now, this isn't an episode to kind of talk about Andor, although I might do a video essay about it later on, maybe sometime this summer, depending on how I feel about it. But no, I was very impressed with it. It's probably the best Disney Star Wars has ever been, and that's kind of the crazy part of it, because I wasn't anticipating Andor to be that good to begin with, but then it was, and I was blown away by it. So eventually, I will watch Rogue One with this new context and kind of see where I feel about it. But yeah, I'm a little bit saddened. That's probably gonna be the last time you see quality Star Wars, at least for the foreseeable future. Now, Star Trek doesn't have the big money that Disney brings to the Star Wars franchise. So it's kind of weird how both franchises are kind of paralleling each other. I think Star Trek needs an Andor show, and what I mean by that is just a top tier quality prestige drama. And I think the only way to do that is to hire a whole new group of people to do it. So yeah, that's probably not going to happen. But I think the contracts for Secret Hideout, the Alex Kurtzman thing, studio, runs out next year or the year afterwards. So we'll have to see how that changes everything. But in terms of Star Wars, we have The Mandalorian and Grogu coming out next year, I think, and the Star Wars Starfighter film starring Ryan Gosling. So that's going to be interesting, I think. So we'll find out. But beyond that, spend a little bit more time talking about the whole overview of the whole franchise. But I think for the next few minutes, I'll dive right into what I think is the main problem with the Star Wars sequels. So I think it is a 100% enormous fuck up, pardon my French, that Lucasfilm decided to basically hand it off to 3 different directors. So I don't know what the thought process was, but okay, you're going to have episode 7 be directed by J.J. Abrams, who's come off of pretty much a really good career in the last 10 years at that point of producing quality work that gets a lot of attention, a lot of views, and money. So you have him do that. Okay, understandable. And then you bring in Ryan Johnson, who I don't really mind as a filmmaker. I enjoyed Looper and I enjoyed his first film, Brick. I don't really think I've watched. I think I watched the first half of Knives Out, but when we were watching it, somebody from my work at the LA Times, who I was working right in front of, we had the mask mandate, so it's probably why I didn't get sick, I think. And yeah, he got sick. He notified everybody at work that he was positive with the virus, and he was down with the sickness, and so that was it with him. Everybody had quarantine for a few days. That was a adventure. So I saw half of Knives Out. So I don't know about much else on that front, at least with that particular thing. So with that being said, I think Ryan Johnson is a great filmmaker. I think that he has a lot of very good um, instincts as somebody who's involved at such a high level in terms of filmmaking, which is why it is such a sadness in my life right now that he gets shorthanded and people hate on him so much about it. And yeah, I don't know what went on with that, but I just hope that he does get a chance to redeem himself or at least get a second shot at Star Wars. Because again, I don't hate him. I think he made a lot of bold choices. Not anywhere close to what JJ did in the episode 8 story, but in episode 7, episode 8, he decided, or Johnson tried to do things that subverted expectations, which I think in general is a good thing to do when you're writing something like this, because you're not writing something that is designed to be that predictable. I mean, it does follow on tropes that have been established in Joseph Campbell's, the hero with a thousand faces, and the heroic myth, the monomyth as a whole. So okay, that's not surprising. But so you put him in charge of that movie, a guy who at that point had only made Looper, I believe, and then you hire another guy, Colin Trevorrow, to do episode 9. And so you're hiring him strictly off of his work on Safety Not Guaranteed, and then I think at that point he'd done um, one of the Jurassic Worlds. I think the first one, and yeah, so that's your trilogy, and then none of them really talk to each other. They're just kind of writing a through line as they go. And then I think there might have been some friction between Ryan Johnson and Colin Trevorrow, and that kind of led to, um, excuse me, and that kind of led to him leaving the project or him getting pulled off the project. And then when The Last Jedi premiered and it was not perceived as well, at least among certain people, including myself, that kind of shot down his entire plans for a Star Wars resurgence, at least for his Star Wars trilogy that he had pitched to Lucasfilm. It's kind of crazy looking back at a lot of the information that's come out about Kathleen Kennedy running Lucasfilm and how like extraordinarily agreeable she was to everybody's decisions. So it's not necessarily on her that this went that way. However, I would say it is on her for not having the foresight to at least make the entire trilogy have some kind of cohesion, or at least have everyone on the same page in terms of like where the story goes. Because it is very apparent in all three films that there is no like plot line that goes from one to the other. I mean, you have the First Order that emerges as like the villain faction, and then you have Kylo Ren, who's the designated villain, and he literally has the strongest arc in the entire sequel films, and that's kind of the weird thing about it because it kind of makes it feel like that was the only one that had been thought through, whereas Ray's plot line is not as well thought out because it just comes out of weird, it just goes into weird directions. But I don't have a problem with Ray as a character. I don't really necessarily believe she's a Mary Sue. My problem with her is that the writers don't know what to do with her, and so they do all these wacky things with her. And that's where I fall off. So for me, I think she's not a bad character in many respects. But like I said, I disagree with the notion that she had to be connected to the rest of the Star Wars nonsense. So, and when I say nonsense, I mean they literally make her the granddaughter of Emperor Palpatine. Like, sit with that for a moment and recognize how kind of stupid that is as an idea. And there's probably some people out there within the fandom menace that believe that what they were trying to do in the Last Jedi was even dumber, which I think is also somewhat ridiculous. Because at least one, Episode 8, making her a nobody is actually restating the mission statement of the entire Star Wars franchise, which is that everyone can make a difference, I think. So that movie is the only one that actually says it, and it's written large, pretty much in every frame, especially the last frame of that film, which is this little kid using the Force to kind of pull a little broom toward him. That is a powerful image, and that's the one image that I think in Last Jedi most of us agree is one that we wouldn't change. So that's why it becomes such a sadness that Episode 9 is such a obvious attempt at damage control to bloodlet whatever's going on or whatever went on with Episode 8, and sort of rewrite it all into something that can be mildly salvageable. That's why some people don't give J.J. Abrams that much of, you know, they don't criticize him as hard as they probably should. Because again, he was brought in for damage control. But then again, at the end of the day, you're being brought in for damage control, and then you just make the worst like corporate decisions in terms of story that you can possibly make. Like, I don't think that's better. I think that's possibly potentially worse. So yeah, I don't necessarily agree with that description. But at least as far as I'm aware, this franchise would have been so much better had it been planned out to the meticulous style and quality as the Andor slash Rogue One saga, the Rebellion saga, as we referred to it. But we can't Monday morning quarterback everything, armchair quarterback it. We have to see what's happened. We have to recognize it, and we have to see is the future. What's the future going to look like post all of this? What are we going to end up with moving forward? That's the general question we have. So I think it's a good question to have. I think it's a good impulse to explore and dive into. And I don't necessarily have an answer. I know what I would do if I was in charge of the Star Wars franchise. I know what I would do if I was in charge of Star Trek, Battlestar Galactica, Stargate. I know what I would do in almost any fan fiction interpretation of where the franchises should go. And I've gamed these out over the years because one, I get extremely bored, and sometimes I need to create stuff that isn't my own IPs. Sometimes I want to play in someone else's sandbox and have fun in that. And that's primarily the use of fan fiction for me. And I did use ChatGPT a few times just to game out what it would think. And a lot of times, ChatGPT kind of kicks back stuff that's a little too pedestrian for my taste. And that's why periodically I'll try to fuck with it and like play with it. Um, Even the thumbnail for this particular video was generated partially through ChatGPT, but the other rest of it, the text and kind of the style and everything, that was on Canva. At the time, Canva Pro. So that's now a thing. So with all of that, yeah, the sequel films could have been so much more than they were. Like Disney comes out, out the gate swinging with Rogue One, and then they just drop the ball with everything else. And then the franchise just like farts and it's done. Like what was like there had to have been guys they pay hundreds of thousands of dollars on the low end a year to like analyze, look at market trends, look at all these things, and then find out what the best move for them would have been. But ultimately, I think what had happened was they did hire a bunch of these bean counters, and those are the people who make all the decisions because they're thinking what makes the most money, what's going to make the most merchandise, what's going to make the most pretty much everything else, and that's just insane to me. Excuse me, I had to sneeze. But yes, um, I'm hoping that things do go more into the Andor route. I do think they're going to try to come up with, because I feel like there's like three different schools of thought working right now within the Star Wars franchise. You have the Filoni school of Star Wars, where you have him and his fancies, which I think includes the Mando, Boba Fett, and Ahsoka shows. So those are all his stuff and what he wants to see and what he wants to do. Um, I think it would be cool for them to decide to use the Mandalorian and Grogu film to start a new trilogy of films that could potentially kind of bridge the gap between what they're doing and the start of the First Order, and then making the Star Wars sequels somehow better in retrospect. But yeah, that's going to be an insane job, and I don't envy the guy who does it. But yeah, because I have a feeling that they're going to do. Because I think the Mandalorian is only like 11 to 15 years after the end of, or after the Battle of Yavin, or the end of or the Battle of Endor. So there's a little bit of interesting things they could do with it, especially leading up to the rise of the First Order and the collapse of the New Republic. So I don't know. There's something they could do, but I can't even begin to think of it, especially now with how everything's going. And then the other two schools that are currently involved are, um, excuse me, the Gilroy branch, which they're done with it now because they finished Rogue One. They got finished with the Andor seasons, and so I think they're pretty much kaput. But I do think of Tony Gilroy as the Nicholas Meyer of Star Wars, because he was a guy who traditionally wasn't a Star Wars fan, or rather, in the Nicholas Meyer comparison, he wasn't a Star Trek fan, and yet he made Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan, arguably the film that saved Star Trek from itself. I think in very many respects, that's what Tony Gilroy did with Andor and Rogue One. He has single-handedly revitalized the franchise with a top tier quality product. I don't think we're ever going to see it again. I don't know if Gilroy wants to do it anymore. I think I saw an interview that he was saying something to the effect of that he's going to be done with it for a few years, and then maybe one day he'll come back to it. But either way, um, it's quite surprising to see. Now, again, we're entering into this other issue with the sequels, which yes, the sequel films are not good, and they're not good strictly because they are tied to a lot of short-term bean counter decisions that ruined that sequel trilogy. And I think that's the tragedy here. That's the thing that even in my own little mind, if they would have gotten one guy, maybe they have JJ do all three. I know he probably didn't want to do it. Or you find another director who can write all three. And then you make a coherent, cohesive trilogy. I mean, how do you fuck that up? How do you make something that already has tons of Timothy Zahn novels written about it? How do you fuck that up? I honestly think that now that they've brought in Grand Admiral Thrawn, that's what I've heard, into the Ahsoka show, that they're using that to lead into the Mandalorian and Grogu movie, and then those will be a trilogy of films that are basically taking the Thrawn part of the Star Wars expanding universe, the Star Wars Legends part, and then that's what they'll be doing with it. That's my larger theory. But now, ad time. This episode of the Fall Show is brought to you by Vega Aerospace. Vega Aerospace. In space. No one can hear you. And now back to the show. So, with all of that, I think now we're in the second half of the show. and we can kind of dive into the topic at hand. So, the little bit of background presented here. What if the Star Wars sequels were great? Now, the title of this episode is generated from the belated media videos of maybe 10, 12 years ago that were entitled something to the effect of "What if the Star Wars prequels were good?" And this guy went in and reviewed and rewrote episode 1, 2, and 3 in a way that I thought worked a lot better for the narrative. Um, there's some people now who are prequel simps, and they've gone in and they've discussed why they believe this guy was wrong. And yeah, a lot of what I've seen and watched have not impressed me. Um, yeah, I can't with those kind of people. But anyway, I want to dive in a little bit into sort of what I would have wanted to do with the Star Wars sequels. Now, I did um, write a version of the Star Wars sequels in between 2012 and 2015. This is, I think, after the acquisition of Star Wars by Disney from George Lucas, but before the release of The Force Awakens, and in response to the belated media videos, as well as the discovery of me watching the Red Letter Media Star Wars prequel reviews. So there was a lot of ideas floating in the air when I came up with this sort of thing, and I might revisit it in a longer form video that'll air on a Monday, probably more of a video essay. Um, I did try to envision my version of the sequel trilogy with the Timothy Zahn books in mind, but instead, um, I decided to go my own way with it. I didn't really want to like use someone else's framework, so when I decided to write my own version, I decided that I would look to other series that inspired me. So I would look to series like Firescape. Now I'm doing it. Farscape, Star Wars Starfighter, the 2001 video game, certain cinematics that I'd seen in The Force Unleashed and the Battlefront games. But I also wanted to write something that was sort of a family saga and would kind of carry on the character dynamics that were present in Cobra Kai and the Top Gun Maverick movie. Because both of those films were set like 34 years after the original, and they both did a fantastic job of rendering the new generation and their trials and their tribulations and telling a story that I felt was very impactful and meaningful. And that's why I'm still shocked to this day that they couldn't come up with anything remotely close to what's presented in those two films, or the TV show and the film. TV show being Cobra Kai and the film being Top Gun Maverick. But my version was, I think, designed for a 2017 release, so that'd be 34 years after the release of Return of the Jedi. So that would coincide with the um, 34 years after the Battle of Yavin, I believe. But I think the mistake too was that there was a 2 year interval in between films with the sequel film trilogy. I think they needed to go back to the 3 years in between method. I think that's just a perfect, event style duration in between films, because it feels like it, if you make it good enough and you drum up enough support, a 3 year gap in between your films is going to do wonders because it'll make people thirst for it, make people want to revisit it. And I think that's what ended up happening with each sequel that occurred. So my version is a 2017 release, and I did envision the trilogy releasing every 3 years. So in fact, if this did happen and I had that power back then, There's a good chance we would have got off episode 7 in 2017, and then we would have tried to aim for 2020 release of episode 8, and then the pandemic would have probably pushed it to 21 or 22. Wouldn't that be some shit? And then episode 9, 2023. So my idea was it would be 34 years after the Battle of Endor. And then it would be Leia Organa is the Supreme Chancellor of the New Republic. And then Han Solo is a retired general in the New Republic, running a legitimate transport consortium. And then Luke Skywalker would be a Jedi Master running the new Jedi Temple. But I would say that they would represent more of a peripheral sort of set of characters, at least in the first version of this. And then Han and Leia would have a stable of 3 kids, a set of twins, a boy and a girl, and then an older boy. And then I was going to say that Luke does not have any children of his own due to the fact that he fears passing on the legacy of the Skywalkers to a generation after learning of who his own father was. So I don't know. I think there's something interesting in that could have been gleaned. And then I think it'd be a little more interesting if he was using that as a way of fostering a new generation of Jedi as the sort of his gift to the galaxy, especially after all of that. And then I would say that Palpatine is dead. In my films, there would never be any somehow Palpatine return sort of shit. We're not going to do that. And then I would say the Empire's remnants would be mostly wiped away by this point. However, I have decided to kind of go back and forth between this idea, and it's kind of explored already in some circles, but at the time I was writing, it seemed okay. So I kind of have this idea for a loose band of privateers modeling themselves on the Empire, and they have a cult worship of Palpatine, and I would call this group the Ascendant instead of the First Order. And I would think they would be more of a constant annoyance to the New Republic more than anything else. But I would have 3 human protagonists, or sorry, 3 new protagonists: a human male, like a hotshot new pilot, uh, a reptilian male scavenger, and a Twi'lek female relic hunter. And yeah, I think that would be my cast for my version of episode 7, 8, and 9. And yeah, it's a little bit aping off of Star Wars Starfighter, but I don't know. I really like that team. Somehow it worked for me. And so that's what I would work with. It would just be a slight different because they wouldn't be the same people. They would just be the people that I would envision for what I want to do. But with that, I would be kind of breaking the series, like the entire Star Wars series, into like 3 eras. I would call the prequel films the Fall of the Old Republic, and in the original films, they would be called the End of the Empire Saga. And then my sequel films would be the Rise of the New Republic. And then I think my films would be Episode 7, The Ashes of Empire, Episode 8, The Will of the Force, and then Episode 9, The Last Jedi. I think my Star Wars sequel trilogy would capture the spirit of the fun and adventure that I feel is lacking in a lot of these Disney Star Wars films. Although I would try to keep it to where, like, when I was walking through Star Wars Galaxy's Edge, I felt like there was a feeling that I had walking through it that I didn't have while I was watching the movies, which was like a spirit of adventure. And that's what I really wanted to see in these sequel films because there's not the same level of that feeling in these. They're really, I mean, they're shot really well. We all know this, but there's none of that same emotional resonance. And that's why I tend to believe that my fiction is written to balance both emotionally resonant and thought-provoking elements. But all these different things would also have to balance action, adventure, comedy, and drama to deliver a cinematic experience that would make the audience laugh, cry, and cheer, and just feel the magic of the movies, because that's what Star Wars started in May 1977, and that's kind of what I want to get back to. And I feel like doing what I'm doing, we would be in a different scenario in a lot of ways. But I don't know, I was thinking, and I don't know how that would work, but I was thinking that there's like in my episode 7, there's like a colony called New Alderaan, and it would come under attack by the Ascendant, by a guy named a human commander named Vex. And I think the name that I used for the Starfighter main character would be Reg, and he would be nearly killed off after facing off with the members of the Ascendant. Um, but he'd be the sole survivor of his unit, and then um, he's like in some kind of asteroid belt, and he's trying to save Supreme Chancellor Leia as their Senate delegation is moving to New Alderaan, and then he's commended before being reassigned to guide a Senate delegation back to Coruscant. And then on the way, the Ascendant attack once again. He is separated from them and is recovered by a scavenger outfit run by a reptilian leader named Drayla. And Drayla takes Reg in shackles to a trading post, basically like a Tortuga in space, space station where they encounter both the relic hunter and the relic hunter being named Norok, who tells Drayla of an upcoming heist in a nearby system, and so we turn into a heist film, sort of. So we do a little bit of fun there. I have this idea for like a specific object, because I have this idea for something called the Kaid, which would be a precursor to both the Jedi and Sith. And I kind of like the idea of kind of getting into lore building elements that otherwise you don't have in 7, 8, and 9 at all. Because the reason why the First Order forms is kind of like not mentioned at all in the sequel films, and that's part of the reason why I think that there should be a thing for that. And yeah, I don't know. There was a lot of ideas I had for my version of it because I even thought about, doing it's similar to Rise of Skywalker in a way that you have a bunch of Star Destroyers that have been converted to having Death Star tech on board them, and I kind of wanted to explore that idea as well. But I had this idea where it's not just Death Star tech; it's like kyber crystal technology that essentially turns a Star Destroyer into a giant lightsaber. And so you have this technology called a Star Saber that you can use to basically shred an entire Star Destroyer in half if you needed to. So I thought that would be a cool visual for the poster. I'd seen something like that before somewhere, but I haven't been able to rediscover the photo. But if I ever do, I want to use that as inspiration. And then over the course of this sequel trilogy that I would kind of, you know, work on, we would dive into a lot of the character dynamics. Because I mean, we do have to dive into, the kids because we obviously want to explore where they go with it. And so, um, after 34 years, these are like adult kids. These are like people in their early 20s. And so at that point, it isn't like outside the realm of possibility to have them actually engage in the actual conflict itself. And so that's kind of the things I'm still kind of working out a little bit. But you'll see on the poster there that, or the thumbnail for this video, because you have the main character that I envisioned, and then you have a couple of the other people in the group with them that I think would be interesting as well. And the more I think about it, the more I want to kind of actually make it a video. But yeah, for me, it's not that we're trying to make this Commander Vex character into like the next Thrawn, but in a way we are. And yeah, I just want to see something a little bit different. I don't really know how to describe it right now, but because I am actually not talking about everything that I devised with this, but I'd be very curious to see what people thought of it. Now, I do want to give enough space to explore a lot of the stuff in between that we don't have an opportunity to kind of discuss within the film itself. Um, I don't know if we can make any of this stuff now with the way Google Video 3 is working, but that would be very interesting to do if we could. But with Star Wars IP being what it is, there's a lot of ethics we got to consider when trying to explore that kind of thing. But I do want to ensure that when we do dive into it, these films are projects that I think everyone can get behind. I don't think it'll unite the franchise. I do think that we're just split up into too many groups right now. I mean, you have the Star Wars traditionalists, the people who prefer the expanded universe, the legends, and then people who only prefer the sequel films. Then you have the ones who are the newer fans that I think are not quite as far along in terms of fandom. And yeah, in general, um, you have sci-fi fans that do love Star Wars like I do, but we just want a little bit more out of it, and that's kind of the main thrust too. One of my biggest, we'll call it rivals at this point on in the past on Twitter was the Knights of Melvin, and those people typically don't like me because I defend the people who they don't like. So that's on them. But in general, I don't think there's anything wrong with supporting Disney Star Wars. I think Disney Star Wars is perfectly fine in many respects. And again, I haven't seen it all, so I'm coming at it from a different angle than they are. But Disney Star Wars is always on the precipice of doing something better, but for whatever reason, it is held back by the atypical corporate greed, corporate bullshit that is constantly befalling the franchise. And just discussing this right now, I'm thinking about seriously going in and exploring the possibility of expanding these ideas that I have for this, and we may even borrow the same title. I think we're probably going to go our own way with it, though. But I do need to add like a stamp that says fan fiction so that we don't get taken down by the Disney fairies, if you will. So the Disney copyright fairies. So it's also something to consider. But got about another minute left before I call it for today on this particular video. So definitely do what you can with sharing the video if you like. I'm doing everything I can on this channel to get the word out, to explore new ideas, to have a little bit more fun. I'll be back in about 10 minutes to cover the topic of our last episode of the evening. And we'll be back again next week as we explore our final two topics before we get back to some other material that we otherwise don't have the opportunity to explore at this very minute. So with that, we have the 1997, the greatest year in cinema history, and then that'll be on Monday, and then on Friday we'll be exploring solar punk, the new genre in search of a story. That'll be on Friday. So if you would like, you can come back again in about 10 minutes and yeah, explore what we have to discuss for the topic of alternate history. That'll be at 7 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, and it'll be an exploration of the multiverse of fiction. So I hope you join us in just a few minutes for that. But yeah, with that, as always, Don't panic. Don't forget your towel. And so long, and thanks for all the fish. See you in about 10 minutes.